I never thought I'd set foot in Pine Grove Valley again. 15 years had passed since I left this place, and I swore I wouldn't come back. But there I was, standing on the creaky porch of my childhood home, the keys to my mother's farmhouse cold and heavy in my hand. The old wooden boards groaned beneath my boots, as if recognizing me after all this time. The autumn wind swept across the endless cornfields, bending the golden stalks like they were bowing in respect. My mother fought harder than anyone I've ever known. She battled cancer with grit and grace, and in her final breath, she held on to this land. Walter Jenkins, my mother's old lawyer and trusted family friend, handed me a thick manila folder. His voice was gentle, but it still cracked when he spoke. "This is yours now, Dan. All 2,100 acres of Johnson family farmland. Just like your mother wanted. For generations, your family worked this soil. It's your legacy now." I ran my fingers along the weathered blue railing on the porch, chipped from years of my mother's careful painting each spring. She never missed a season, even when the treatments left her too weak to stand for long. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Work. Again. My bosses at Northeast Power Authority weren't thrilled when I took emergency family leave. But what choice did I have? My mother was gone. And someone had to handle everything she left behind. I hadn't even unpacked a single bag when a sharp knock rattled the old screen door. Standing there was a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, wearing a tailored pink blazer and a smile so tight it could cut glass. Behind her, two men in Meadowbrook Homeowners Association polo shirts stood with clipboards in hand. "You must be Margaret Johnson's son," she said, offering a manicured hand that felt cold and calculating. "I'm Karen Thompson, president of the Meadowbrook HOA. We were so sorry to hear about your mother's passing." I shook her hand, trying to hide my confusion. "Thank you, but what brings the HOA out here? This farm isn't part of your development." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before tightening again. "Well, that's actually why we're here. There are some covenant violations we need to discuss." "Covenant violations?" I frowned. "This farm's been here since 1897. Your neighborhood's been around what, 10, maybe 15 years? 15, she corrected briskly. And while that may have been true once, your mother never formally contested the annexation of this property. According to county records filed 5 years ago, this land falls under our jurisdiction now. My stomach twisted into a knot. That's impossible. She handed me a packet of official-looking documents. These papers were filed while your mother was still the owner. As you can see, the Meadowbrook Association's boundaries were legally expanded to include this property. I stared at the signature on the bottom of the document. It looked like my mother's handwriting, but something was off. Too perfect. Too neat for someone battling chemotherapy side effects. My mother's writing had become shaky, frail, nearly unreadable in her final months. "There must be some mistake," I said, my throat dry. My mother would never agree to this. "Nevertheless," Karen said with rehearsed politeness, gesturing toward the barn. "Those farm vehicles are in violation of storage ordinances, and that fence needs to be brought up to code. We'll give you 30 days to address these issues before fines begin to accrue." As they turned and walked back to their gleaming SUV, I noticed bright orange survey stakes driven into the soil at the edge of our cornfield. They weren't there 3 days ago when we buried my mother. The moment their car disappeared down the dirt road, my legs gave out, and I sat on the porch steps. I felt the weight of 2 centuries pressing on my shoulders. My family built this land from nothing. My mother fought to keep it alive while cancer ate away at her body. And now, they wanted to steal it with forged papers and smirking smiles. I wasn't going to let them. I didn't sleep that night. The house was quiet, too quiet, filled with the absence of my mother's presence and the weight of questions I couldn't ignore. Papers were strewn across the kitchen table, tax forms, medical bills, deeds dating back generations, each one a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to believe existed. My mind kept circling back to that signature on Karen's annexation documents. It looked like Mom's, but something about it gnawed at me. My mother's hand had trembled even when signing greeting cards toward the end. That signature was smooth, deliberate, almost practiced. At 2 in the morning, I found myself in her office, staring at the locked filing cabinet she'd always guarded. The key, I realized with a hollow ache, now rested on the chain around my neck, the same one the funeral director had handed me along with her wedding band. My hands shook as I unlocked the drawer and pulled it open. Beneath stacks of old photographs and faded receipts, I found a leather-bound journal with 3 words embossed on the cover: "Keep fighting." I opened it slowly. My mother's handwriting was familiar, slanted, and steady in the early pages. She detailed every encounter with the HOA, citations for the tractor being visible from the road, warnings about the rooster crowing too early, and complaints about the height of the corn stalks. But then the entries darkened. She wrote about surveys mysteriously shifting overnight, boundary markers moved without explanation, and strangers trespassing on the property to take photos of supposed violations. The most gut-wrenching entries came near the end. "They're taking advantage of my sickness. I don't have the strength to fight them anymore. God forgive me for failing to protect what my father and his father built." I wiped tears from my cheeks and turned the page to find photos, clear images of the original boundary markers, along with copies of old plat maps and audio transcriptions of conversations with HOA board members. The last page held a yellow sticky note with a single name and number: Rachel Porter, attorney. Call when you're ready to fight back. Before I could even think, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily Harris, an old family friend who worked in the county clerk's office. "Found something strange in your mom's property records. Can we talk tomorrow?" My heart pounded. I texted back yes and set the phone down, just as headlights flashed across the front yard. I peeked through the curtain. Karen. Sitting in her black Mercedes. Taking photos of my barn. The next morning, I sat across from Rachel Porter in her office lined with law books and framed articles about cases she'd won. She flipped through my mother's journal and the annexation documents, her brow furrowing deeper with every page. "These signatures don't match," she said, pointing out subtle differences. "And the dates, look at this. Your mother was in the hospital for surgery on the day she supposedly signed this land transfer. Physically impossible." I felt cold all over. "What do we do?" "We file criminal charges for fraud," Rachel said. "But be ready, the Meadowbrook HOA has money and power. Karen's husband sits on the zoning commission. They won't go down quietly." Driving home, I stopped at the county records office. Mrs. Martinez greeted me with a sad smile. "Your mother helped my son get a scholarship, Dan. I never forgot that. I've been expecting you." She pulled up digital records on her computer, and my stomach twisted into knots. The boundaries of our land had been redrawn 3 times in 6 months. Each change filed by Jack Thompson. Each time, more of our family farm slipped into Meadowbrook's grasp. Why didn't anyone question this? I asked. "We tried," she said softly. "But Jack has influence. I made you copies of everything." She handed me a USB drive. "You're going to need this." That evening, while I was still processing everything, an email from Karen landed in my inbox: official notice of community development plan. 60 luxury homes to be built on what she now called Meadowbrook East, my mother's eastern cornfield. Construction scheduled to begin in 5 days. I was still staring at the screen when my work laptop chimed with an alert. Sector 12, where our farm sat, flagged with capacity issues for new development. Any major expansion would require approval, my approval. I leaned back in my chair, breathing slowly. They had no idea who they were messing with. Before I could savor the thought, my phone buzzed again. Emily, texting frantically. Dan, I found something worse. Karen and Jack's private foundation made large donations to the hospital around the time your mother was undergoing treatment. Some nurses reported pressure to have her sign documents while sedated. My blood turned to ice. They hadn't just forged signatures. They had bribed hospital staff to coerce my mother during her weakest moments. I felt the air leave my lungs. The betrayal ran deeper than I'd feared. But they weren't finished. That night, another neighbor, Mr. Ramirez, showed up on my porch. He looked down at the ground, twisting his cap in his hands. I thought you should know. Karen threw a private party the night after your mother's funeral. Told everyone the land was as good as hers. They toasted to her win. I clenched my fists so tight my nails bit into my palms. I went back inside and opened the power grid map for Sector 12 on my laptop. They thought they had the land. But they still needed power. And that was something they could only get through me. The next morning, I woke to the rumble of engines shaking the ground beneath my bedroom window. I jumped out of bed and threw open the curtains. My heart dropped. 3 massive yellow bulldozers were crawling up the gravel road toward my eastern fields. Workers in neon vests strode confidently alongside them, led by none other than Karen Thompson, her pink blazer spotless and her face beaming with smug satisfaction. She pointed toward the towering old maple trees that had stood for generations, giving crisp orders like she was the queen of this valley. I didn't bother with shoes. I pulled on my jeans and bolted outside, still in my undershirt, waving my arms furiously. Stop. This is private property. You can't do this. Karen didn't even flinch. Good morning, neighbor, she sang out sweetly, clipboard in hand. Beautiful day to break ground, isn't it? Before I could respond, the bulldozer blade sliced into the first maple, sending ancient bark and leaves tumbling as if they meant nothing. The sickening crack of the tree's trunk snapping felt like a punch to the gut. Sheriff Tom Carter's cruiser screeched onto the scene, lights flashing. He climbed out, adjusting his hat with a grim look. What's going on here? Karen handed him a thick folder, her smile never slipping. All permits are in order, Sheriff. We're starting phase 1 of the Harvest Estates project today. Sheriff Carter flipped through the paperwork, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. Ma'am, these permits are for Lot 156. This here is Lot 27, still registered to Johnson Family Farms. Karen's smile faltered for the first time, just a flicker, then reappeared, brighter and tighter. Oh, I'm sure that's just a clerical error. Everything was approved months ago. Before I could press the issue, my phone buzzed with a work emergency alert. Substation 9 was down, thousands of homes without power. I looked between Karen, the bulldozers, and the sheriff, torn in two. Please, I begged Sheriff Carter, don't let them touch anything else. He nodded. I'll hold them off. I sprinted to my truck, handling the outage remotely from my laptop at a gas station parking lot, my heart racing the entire time. 3 hours later, I returned to the farm, praying they'd been stopped in time. But what I found made my stomach twist in knots. The bulldozers were gone, but not before they'd torn down nearly an acre of trees and left muddy tire tracks gouged into the earth like scars. I stared at the destruction, the ground ripped apart where my great-grandfather had once planted his first crops. I stumbled toward the barn, and that's when I saw them, bright red cease and desist notices plastered across the walls and fence posts. The papers accused me of obstructing community development and threatened massive fines if I continued interfering. My hands trembled as I tore them down. I called Rachel immediately. They're trying to intimidate you, she said flatly. Don't remove the notices yet. Photograph everything. We'll use it all in court. The power in the house flickered, then died completely. I rushed outside to check the breaker panel, intact. Then I saw it, my power line had been cut at the pole, clean and deliberate. A voice drifted across the yard. Going somewhere important? Karen stood at the fence line with Greg Wilson and two unfamiliar men in suits. She spoke loudly, performing for the people watching from their porches and cars. We've discovered illegal power connections originating from your property, Dan. The power company's investigating. You cut my lines. I shouted. This farm's had legal service for 70 years. Not according to our emergency inspection request, she said with a venomous smile. But we're willing to resolve this if you'll sign the new boundary agreements. She unrolled a massive map, and my breath caught. The new boundary line cut directly through my house. I drove to the Power Authority office, hoping to fix the issue myself. But when I arrived, I found my office door locked, and my boss, Richard, standing in the hallway, looking anywhere but at me. He handed me an envelope. You're on administrative leave, Dan. Pending investigation into misuse of authority. What investigation? Allegations that you manipulated power access to intimidate the HOA, he muttered. Jack Thompson brought the complaint to the board. Jack Thompson. Karen's husband. Of course. I sat in my truck, staring blankly at the dashboard as my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Is this the Johnson farm? A rough voice asked. Yes. Dave Miller, Channel 8 News. We've received anonymous tips about illegal utility tampering on your property. Care to comment? Before I could answer, I heard the roar of engines behind me. In my rearview mirror, 3 bulldozers bearing the Harvest Estates logo rumbled down my driveway, followed by black SUVs with private security guards. I punched the gas, racing back home. But by the time I arrived, they were already there, lining up to clear my western field. Sheriff Ray Collins met me at the end of the drive, holding a freshly stamped emergency court order. Signed by Judge Phillips. Judge Phillips, Karen's uncle. I'm sorry, Dan. My hands are tied. I watched helplessly as the bulldozers roared to life and carved into my family's land, cameras from the local news stations capturing every minute of my humiliation. I didn't sleep that night. The storm cellar became my refuge as heavy rain hammered the roof and thunder cracked through the night sky. I sat on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by shelves of preserves my mother had canned with loving care, clutching the rusted metal box I'd found hidden behind a loose board. Inside were the documents that could finally turn the tide, original land grants from the 1800s, photographs of my grandfather with county officials, and most importantly, the 1952 power grid easement agreement that granted my family perpetual override authority over any infrastructure crossing our land. In the dim glow of my flashlight, I traced the clause circled in faded red ink. The Johnson family retains exclusive control over modifications or usage of utility lines on their property in perpetuity. It was ironclad. My mother had hidden it here, her final weapon. But it wasn't just the documents that gave me hope. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors. People who had once avoided me were now offering support. Word was spreading. Rumors of fraud, coercion, and corruption were too loud to ignore. The community, once dazzled by Karen's promises of luxury and rising property values, was starting to see the rot beneath the surface. The following evening, I stood in the packed community center for the monthly Meadowbrook HOA meeting. The air was heavy with tension, the murmur of whispers hanging just under the echo of folding chairs scraping the floor. At the front table, Karen sat in her bright red blazer, her smile as sharp as ever, but her eyes flicked nervously across the room. She had no idea what was coming. The secretary called the meeting to order. Karen stood confidently, addressing the room with a rehearsed speech about progress, community improvement, and the bright future of Harvest Estates. She spoke of obstacles and delays, glossing over the bulldozers and protests as if they were minor inconveniences. Then she moved on to addressing interference, and that was my cue. "Excuse me," I said, stepping forward from the back of the room. Heads turned. Conversations fell silent. I could feel the weight of every eye on me. "My name is Dan Johnson. And I have something to share with this board, and this community." Karen's smile froze. "This is a closed meeting," she said, her voice clipped. Rachel Porter stepped up beside me. "As legal counsel for the Johnson family, my client has the right to respond to any claims regarding his property." Karen hesitated, then forced a nod. "You have 2 minutes." I connected my laptop to the projector and took a deep breath. What I'm about to show you isn't speculation. It's fact. My mother, Margaret Johnson, did not sign away this land. The first slide displayed a signature page dated July 17th of last year. "This document," I said, "shows my mother's supposed signature. But on that date, she was in the hospital undergoing emergency surgery." Gasps echoed through the room. I advanced to the next slide, hospital records confirming her hospitalization. Tom, one of the senior board members, frowned deeply. "Is this true?" Karen's face flushed. "I'm sure it's just a clerical error." I continued, flipping through forged agreements, each with dates that aligned with my mother's medical treatments. Then I played the audio recording. Karen's voice filled the room, cold and casual. "She'll be dead soon anyway. Just backdate the papers. We'll deal with the kid later." The room erupted into chaos. Board members muttered angrily. Neighbors gasped and shook their heads. Mrs. Callahan stood up, her voice trembling with fury. "I've lived in Pine Grove Valley for 60 years. The Johnson family built this community. You should be ashamed." Karen banged her gavel, but her voice cracked. "Order! Order!" Rachel stepped forward again. "We've filed official complaints for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. A criminal investigation is underway." I wasn't done. I brought up the final slide, the county power grid, showing that the entire Meadowbrook development depended on infrastructure that crossed my land. As regional supervisor, I explained, I am required by law to approve any development-related upgrades. I placed the original easement agreement on the table for everyone to see. Without the Johnson family's consent, no new construction can proceed. The room fell silent again. Then Tom spoke quietly. "I move that we suspend all HOA development plans pending investigation." "I second that," another board member echoed. Karen's mask shattered. Her voice rose to a shriek. "You don't understand. We've already made commitments." But no one was listening anymore. The empire she'd built on deception and arrogance was crumbling before her eyes. 3 hours later, I stood on the courthouse steps beneath a sky so blue it felt unreal. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted my name, and microphones crowded toward me. Karen Thompson had just been led out in handcuffs, her head down, her red blazer wrinkled and stained from the chaos inside. Jack Thompson followed behind her, pale and hollow-eyed, his expensive suit doing nothing to cover the weight of disgrace. The courtroom had seen it all, the forged documents, the bribery of hospital staff, the recordings of Karen mocking my dying mother, and the ironclad power easement agreements my family had safeguarded for generations. The judge's final ruling froze all development, dissolved the HOA pending criminal prosecution, and returned full control of the land to the Johnson family. I looked out at the reporters and raised my hand for silence. My family has farmed this land for generations. We never wanted a fight. We only wanted what was rightfully ours, what was built with sweat, sacrifice, and heart. This wasn't just about property lines. It was about standing up to bullies who thought power meant control. But real power is protecting what matters even when you stand alone. That evening, back at the farm, I sat on the porch steps where it all began. Sheriff Carter stood in the driveway, overseeing the removal of the last bulldozer from my fields. Neighbors gathered, many who had once stood with Karen, now offering help, apologies, and even friendship. Greg Wilson handed me a plate of homemade pie and said quietly, "We got it wrong. But if you'll have us, we'd like to make it right." 2 months later, the barn doors swung open to reveal the first gathering of the new Pine Grove Valley Community Association. No boardroom bullies. No secret deals. Just neighbors, kids playing on hay bales, laughter echoing across fields that would never be divided again. I watched the last Meadowbrook sign come down and be replaced with a simple wooden plaque, Johnson Family Farm, EST 1897. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the fields glowed golden, I heard my mother's voice in memory, telling me to hold the line, to protect what matters. I smiled. Her legacy would stand, stronger than ever. But I couldn't help but wonder, how many others out there have been cornered by HOA power plays, manipulative Karens, and rules that make no sense? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.